Alright, hey everyone, this is going to be my video about solving equations with completing the square. So I'll show you the steps to solve it in a second, but just real quick, I'm going to have these things up here the whole time and I'll use it later. I'll show you why in a second I'm going to use it. But if you remember, x plus 3 squared is the same thing as x squared plus 6x plus 9. And I could go through how I got that, but I did that on a previous video called Squaring Binomials. So if you want to watch that, you can, but basically, you don't need to exactly know how to do it. X plus 3 squared is the same thing as x squared plus 6x plus 9. So let's keep that in mind, and it's the same goes for x plus 4 squared and x plus 7 squared. Well, let's keep that in mind when we do this first practice problem, which is going to be x squared plus 6x minus 15 equals 0. So your first instinct, well, first of all, you're trying to find x here. You got an equation, you got x in it, you're trying to find what numbers could work for x to make this equation equal on both sides. So firstly, you should look to see if you can do it just a regular way of factoring, which is what I did on my video factoring trinomials. So what you do there, and I would recommend watching that video if you haven't already, but what you do there is you take that number out to the side, this negative 15, and you say what numbers multiply into 15, negative 15, that can add up to positive 6. So we've got 1 and 15, or sorry, negative 1 and 15, 1 and negative 15, 3 and negative 5, negative 3 and 5, and I think that's about all. But you can add all those up if you want. I'm not going to go through all that, but if you did add all these up, what you would get is none of them are equal to 6, positive 6 right there. And that's unfortunate because that's usually the easiest way to solve an equation, but sometimes it doesn't end up like that, so you're gonna have to know how to solve it if it isn't factorable. That's what they call it. If it isn't factorable easy, then you're gonna have to know how to solve it in a different way. So I'm gonna show you the steps to using this method, which is called completing the square. So I'm just gonna go ahead and erase all that, but completing the square starts with moving our number over our constant. That's what it's called. So it's going to be this negative 15 right here. So I want to move it over to this x side because we want our x's on one side and our not x's on the other side. So step 1 is going to be move constant over. Move constant over. So what we have to do there is add 15 to both sides like I showed. So now what we have is x squared plus 6x equals 15. So I left that blank there because we're about to fill it in, but let me show you why we're going to fill it in with what we do. So let's go back up to here. X plus 3 squared is the same thing as x squared plus 6x plus 9, as I explained at the start. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill it in with what completes the square. So that's going to be our second step, complete the square, and that's where it gets its name. Because we want to have this equation so that we can use the square root method to solve for x, and that's going to be one of the only ways to actually solve for x. So, and I'll show you in a second why it exactly works, but x squared plus 6x plus 9. And in a second, we're going to change this x squared plus 6x plus 9 to x plus 3 squared. But before we do that, you have to remember, you can't just add stuff to one side, you have to add it to both sides. So whenever you add something to one side, you have to add it to the other side. So don't forget, when you're completing the square, you're going to have to add it to both sides of the equation. So now what we have here is x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 15 plus 9. And 15 plus 9 is 24. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change it, this x squared to the left side, I'm just going to change it to x plus 3 squared because they're identical. We know that these two things up here are the same. So what we have is x plus 3 squared equals 24, and that 24 is just 15 plus 9. So I hope you know how I got there. And don't forget that anytime you can email me with your questions about this. But now we're going to move on to the next step, which is going to be take the square root of both sides. And I hope you guys watched my last video, which was on solving using square root. And if you didn't, you're going to kind of have to know what we did there in order to solve this next one. But I'll still explain it. So what we want to do is we're trying to find x by itself. But before we can get x by itself, we're going to have to get rid of this parentheses squared thing. So the way to do that is what I showed in the video on solving using square root, which is you just take this big square root of both sides. So like I said, you got to do something to both sides when you do it, and that works with square root as well as addition. So when you take the square root of that big thing being squared, you just basically get rid of that square root. So when I write it down here, we're going to have x plus 3 equals the square root of 24. But I hope you watched that last video because this is really important. You can't forget that when you take the square root of the number 24 or any number and take the square root of both sides, you have to remember this special little thing that's just positive negative. So what you've got is positive negative square root of 24. So that's where we're at right now. X plus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 24. So our final answer will be, well, let me just show you how I get there real quick. And just all you got to do to get x now is just minus 3 and minus 3. So our final answer is x equals, I'm just going to write it like this, negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 24. And that's the same thing as the plus or minus square root of 24 minus 3. So I could write it like that, but it's the same exact thing. I just prefer to write it this way. So yeah, that's the final answer. Basically, that means that this long thing right here, which is negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 24, is what could get you it to be equal on both sides in that original equation up there. This x squared plus 6x minus 15 equals 0. So I hope you know how I got that. I'm just going to do one more practice problem with you real quick. And I'm now remembering that I didn't really complete the steps over here. I'm just going to write our last step, which was to solve for x. That's pretty much all it was. After you take the square root of both sides, and don't forget that plus or minus, you just got to do whatever you need to solve for that x value. So in that, I used the x plus 3 squared that we already had up here to simplify it down to what we need it to be the square. But this next problem, you can't always just have that x plus 3 squared is x squared plus 6 plus 9. So sometimes you're going to have to just use your own logic to find it. And I will show you how to do that in your next problem, which is going to be x squared plus 16x minus 61 equals 0. So up here, we don't really have a plus 16x in any of these. And these are just some examples I threw out there. I mean, there are infinitely many possible things you could use. I just use those as examples. But sometimes you're not always going to have an example. So with this problem, and I'm sorry for scrolling up and down so much, but for this problem, we're going to use those exact same steps, and then I'm going to show you an extra thing that you're going to have to do if you don't already know what your square is. So first of all, I hope you remember, we want to add 61 to both sides to move it over, so we have our x's on one side and our non-x's on the other. So we're at x squared plus 16x equals 61. So now this is what I think is the hardest part to remember from completing the square, but I'm just going to show you the way you do it. You're not always going to just immediately know what you're filling into this extra spot to get the square. So you're going to have to do some math to find it. And what you got to do is you take your coefficient of x, which is going to be your 16x. So I'm going to take 16 out over here to the side. and I'm going to say, what is 16 divided by 2 and times itself, or squared? So divided by 2 and squared. And that wasn't the best way to show it exactly, but what you do is just cut it in half and then square it. So what's 16 in half? 16 divided by 2, it's 8. Then we square 8. 8 squared equals 64. So what we fill in there is 64 plus 64. So that is what we fill it in. And I can show you up there. Remember our last one was our square was x plus 3 squared, and we got that to be x squared plus 6x plus 9. Well, how do you find that 9? Well, all it is just that 6 cut in half. What is 6 cut in half? It's 3. And then 3 squared is 9. So that's how they got the 9 in that situation. If I hadn't just given it to you, that's what I would have shown you to get the 9. So that's what we have to do. And now let's move on to the next step, which is going to be, if you remember right, well, first of all, I'm just going to simplify it. X squared plus 16x plus 64 equals 61 plus 64, which is 125. So the next thing we got to do is just simplify it down to what we know already it is, which is x plus 8 squared. So I hope you can figure out, based on what I described, that these two things are the same. X squared plus 16x plus 64 is x plus 8 squared. And where I got that 8 from is it's the number that you cut it in half to get. So if I was to multiply this out like in my squaring binomials video, I would get that this is x plus 8 times x plus 8, and then I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically, you just go across like that, and that was really rusty, but when you simplify this down, you get x squared plus 16x plus 64. So that's how I got the x plus 8 being squared. It's the number that you divide, it's the number that you get when you cut it in half and then square it. So let me finish writing this out. X plus 8 squared equals 125. And then next step was to take the square root of both sides. So you've got x plus 8 equals, and I'm just skipping writing the square, but what I just did was take the square root of that, equals the square root of 125. And I actually just almost forgot, but the positive negative, you cannot forget the positive negative square root of 125. So all you got to do after that is just subtract 8. So x equals plus or minus square root of 125 minus 8, and you're done. It's kind of a complicated answer, and you're going to get a whole range of different answers, but that is completing the square. I hope you know how to do that now, and I know it's kind of complicated, so if you have any questions, you can email me at jg55629@students.hcde.org. I'm not going to write that whole thing out, but yeah, so I hope you learned a lot in that video, and again, if you have any questions, email me. So yeah, see you on the next video. Thanks.